Has the free trade agreement increased trade and been prosperous for Canada? When the trade talks started, Canada had a trade surplus with the United States. With the introduction of free trade, this surplus dropped dramatically. In 1989, the first year of free trade, Canada's trade performance was the worst in its history. By 1992, its trade surplus had dropped by 50%. Some claim that an increase in exports proved that the agreement was working. True, exports had increased during the first 3 years of free trade by $47.1 billion. But imports grew by $77.6 billion over the same period, thus resulting in a cumulative trade deficit of $30.5 billion. The drastic reversal of Canada's trade balance from surplus to deficit was directly reflected by a progressive decline in employment and a corresponding rise in unemployment. This chart compares levels of employment in Canada 2 years before and 2 years after the Free Trade Agreement.
We did better in the 17 years before free trade than we did in the first 17 years of the Free Trade Agreement. And in every single important economic indicator, in the level of wages, in the capture of the extent of the U.S. market, in the ability of Canadian families to have a higher standard of living, there's a whole long list.
In the first 3 years of free trade, 1.4 million jobs disappeared. More than 500,000 manufacturing jobs were wiped out, over 24% of the entire Canadian manufacturing sector. Plant closures continued, including some of the best-known manufacturers in Canada. How many companies has Canada lost? We'll get to that in a moment, along with an explanation of what these losses signify for the Canadian economy. In one 6-month period in 1990, 97 Ontario plants closed or scaled down production. In the first 7 months of 1992, at least 86 plants shut down permanently. By May of '92, over 28% of Ontario's manufacturing sector disappeared in just over 3 years. According to Investment Canada, from 1985 to 2008, 11,043 Canadian-owned companies were acquired by foreign owners. You may verify this at Investment Canada's website. This amounts to some 40 companies per month for 23 years. The 1,100-page text of NAFTA, the 1993 North American Free Trade Agreement, is available through the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade website. NAFTA essentially extends the Free Trade Agreement to include Mexico and, in some areas, takes the Free Trade Agreement provisions even further. Of particular concern is Chapter 11 and Chapter 15. For the first time in a multilateral free trade agreement, foreign corporations were given the right to sue national governments directly for any law, regulation, or program which causes them loss or damage and which they feel breaches the North American Free Trade Agreement rules. Competition policy, monopolies, and state enterprises spells out prohibitive controls on all Canadian Crown corporations. Henceforth, it decrees, Crown corporations must act solely in accordance with commercial considerations. Most of Canada's Crown corporations, the CBC, CN, Petro-Canada, Canada Post, Air Canada, and many others were set up precisely to serve needs not being met by commercial interests. By the way, what do Canadians think about NAFTA today? 46% think the U.S. benefited the most from NAFTA. 30% think Mexico did. 17% are unsure. Only 7% of Canadians believe Canada has been the prime beneficiary of NAFTA. In the Toronto Star of October 2006, David Olive writes, "In the past 2 years, more than a dozen of Canada's largest corporations, with total assets of more than $57 billion, have been swallowed by foreign predators." And the response has been, well, there really hasn't been a response. There are no calls in Parliament, any legislature, the media, or the halls of the academe for a royal commission on the consequences of our economic sovereignty from this unprecedented yard sale of Canadian industrial assets. The Security and Prosperity Initiative was launched by the Canadian Council of Chief Executives in 2003. Proponents argue that the SPI, also known as the North American Union, an extension of NAFTA, is necessary in order to compete with emerging China and the European Union. They also maintain that such a union must be secured against terrorist attacks. The North American Competitive Council was established in 2006. Corporate members, along with their Mexican counterparts, have a direct influence on government policy. Without any media coverage, public forum, or consultation with environmental, social, or labor groups. The North American Union is an understanding of intent, not a legal document. As such, its fusion of corporate military interests constitutes an end run around democracy. Our prime ministers have attended secretive North American Union meetings wherein the press was not allowed and no substantive statements were issued. In August of 2007, Harper, Bush, and Calderon meet in Montebello, Quebec, and again in New Orleans in 2008. Again, with no media coverage. But that's not all. There are also secretive provincial regional agreements. In the West, the Trade, Investment, and Labor Mobility Agreement allows corporations and individuals to sue provincial governments for any government measure they feel restricts profits. Other provinces and some U.S. states are also interested in signing on. In the East, Atlantica aims to create a massive binational trading bloc where wages are lower, unions smaller, and regulations protecting our health and environment are weaker. All of these agreements, the lack of any public discussion or immediate debate, stresses the reality that it is citizens versus governments in the New World Order. The end result of these free trade agreements, that is, the gutting of the Canadian manufacturing sector, the loss of financial and other institutions to foreign owners, and the loss of control over our own resources and governing powers, is apparently what the corporate sector wants. At best, this will weaken the Canadian economy to such an extent that it will never be able to flourish. At worst, it will lead to a balkanization, or indeed, even the end of Canada as a nation state. This dissolution will likely be carefully controlled by a corporate media spin. It may be interpreted as a natural process in a globalized world.